Now, the other problem is, after he's made this, and go through and remake the mesh, Kenny, the curves that he used to create the mesh are still there. They still exist. And they're doing nobody any good. So basically, he wants to get rid of those. And the real quick way to get rid of those is by using the, one of my favorite keyboard shortcuts, the W key for statistics. W stands for statistics. Comes up all the time. If you want to find it in the menu, it's in the display menu, I believe. But it's just W for weird keyboard shortcut. And it works for either point or polygon. This is the statistics menu. The thing that's important is it gives you a whole bunch of information. How many total polygons are in it, how many faces. You notice it says 5 curves. It tells us there are 5 curves. The important thing to note is that there are plus and minus keys. The plus and minus keys mean select or deselect. So if he hits select on the line next to where it said 5 curves, it selects all 5 curves. He can now cut them, delete them, paste them to another layer, whatever. Yeah, pick them all and bring them somewhere else. This is one method of creating objects. And the best analogy to the real world is like the type kind of sculpture where they create a framework underneath something and then cover it with like chicken wire and then put material on top of that. Everyone's sort of seen that sort of technique. That's one way to sculpt, okay? Another way to sculpt is to basically take a piece of wood or marble or something like that and then cut out the parts that you don't need. And that's the equivalent of metaform. Do you want to say something?
Right now it looks like this is a solid object, but if I try and render this, it'll actually have a seam going across the center here. And the reason why is because...
Do you want to take that in and show it? How sure are you this is going to have a seam?
Positive.
Okay. This is a big problem people end up having in modeling, is they end up with these random seams. This is why I'm stopping him on that point merging thing. It's an absolutely crucial point. And again, you can see the seam there, and if he renders it out, you'll see the seam even more. But you see the seam already in the OpenGL version. Okay, heading back to Modeler, why are we getting that seam? And the answer is that there are duplicate points in there.
Yeah, every time you create a patch across the basic area, so I created 2 different patches here. I created them separately though, so they're not actually connected across the seam there. And again, with a really complex model, you end up doing, there's a couple hundred patches, or you can have, a lot of different patches, a lot of different areas. That you have
just
to
pick
fill
one of
in.
the points where the seam is, and you'll notice he's got point selected. Just pick one.
Pick one.
Yeah. If he picks one, you'll notice it says 2 right next to a point. That's because there's points in exactly the same position. So the quick way to get rid of those is lightweight with a function that gets rid of duplicate points. Go to that, Ken. It's the merge point function, and there's basically 3 options: automatic, fractional, or absolute. Automatic is the one to use in this case because it basically takes anything in exactly the same position and it gets rid of them. So by getting rid of those duplicate points, you notice the seam is gone. If you're getting seams in your objects, it's very, very likely you've got duplicate points in there. Any questions on that? Again, this is a reason to avoid spline patching in general. Not like the plague, but there's just better techniques for doing it.
Yeah.
Because again, this is creating duplicate points.
Spline patching is really useful for a lot of different objects. Like this is a spline model I created for an airplane that I was doing one time. And it's I mean, you can see how complex it can get. But at the same time, it allowed me to get really nice, complex curves and, make it really nice and smooth. And I had a lot of interesting things in the back. The problem is that, you can see how many patches are on here, how many segments. And, doing them all was, was a real chore. Yeah. And then again, spline patching creates a lot of cleanup. You have to go in and merge points and, make sure you don't have any 2-point polygons and make sure things are cool to actually come up with the...
Okay, so any questions on spline patch modeling before we move on? Let's just go over Metaform real briefly with just one of the objects. The idea behind Metaform, hey Kenny, can you get your enterprise loaded up quickly?
Sure.
We'll just give a real quick example. And again, I contrast this as opposed to chicken wire over a framework. The way Metaform works is it's like taking a crude version and then honing it down. It's like taking a piece of wood or something like that and then turning it in. So here's a real crappy looking enterprise, right? Not particularly impressive looking, but running Metaform on it a couple times or running Metaform Plus can very quickly look very nice. And again, the whole idea here is with Metaform, you want to start with a simple, crude, coarse version. What I kind of refer to as the Dodge Dart version of an object. That's how to go from a Dodge Dart to a Lamborghini is you start with the crude version, pre-Metaform, and then you metaform it. You might try metaforming it a couple times, then you'll go, this isn't working the way I want. Undo it, then go back to the original pre-metaform version, make the changes on your coarse version. Don't try to make the changes after you've made all those polygons.
One of the things about metaform in general is you really start off with basic shapes, and I mean completely basic shapes. I mean, this is how you do the coolest of organic things, but there's a bunch of tricks you usually use to do that.
Hey,
four-point polygons.
Why don't you show the gun?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Let's go through that. Okay, we'll do the little Julia Child demo thing, where we'll start with the, oh look, here's the finished cake. Put it in the oven and it's done. Show the full version. Talk about the genesis, where you ripped this off from, in other words.
Yeah, this is from a book called Appleseed, and it's a Japanese anime book, and it was a gun design he had, and it was really pretty cool, and it lent itself real well to doing things in metaform for obvious reasons, because it was really organic.
And do you have the background image for this?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so let's start with that. So this is where we're going to get to. Here's the final cake. Okay, pretty cool object. And again, very, very organic, very smooth. It's the sort of thing that people like.
So this is I mean, it looks like a fairly complex model, but it's actually really easy. The basic way I started off with this was by grabbing an image of the actual background image, and I think I used just a video camera and a Snappy on this.
So here's the image that he scanned, and Kenny's going to go around, he's going to rough out the shape. What you're going to notice is he's going to work pretty quickly here, and he's just trying to get a coarse representation, because the way metaform works is you start with coarse objects. This is a positive benefit if you cannot draw or something like that. Do not think you're going to start with something detailed. He's starting with kind of, this, again, crappy version of it. And the other thing you'll notice is he's doing sort of sections where the holes would be. For instance, you see where the holes would be in the sides of the gun. I think a lot of people would start this and they'd get clever and they'd say, okay, I'll do the basic shape, but then I'll Boolean out the middle, right? No, don't do that.
This is sort of a way that I differ from a lot of people when I model, is that I don't like to waste a lot of time. Now again, metaform works well with squares, and if you're doing meta-NURBS, for instance, you're required four-sided polygons. So why would I draw big empty shapes like this that are not really square, and these wouldn't metaform right? The reason why is because it's very hard to visualize things in 3D. If you're doing something like a face or a dinosaur or whatever, something really organic, something really complex, it's very difficult to take a whole bunch of boxes and change that into the shape of that creature. It's sort of a more difficult thing. So what I like to do is I like to take the overall shapes and take big sections, and I'll rough out the shapes in general. Now at this point, it's a lot easier after I've roughed out those shapes to actually go in and break up the polygons simply by going in and stitching them out. Because one of the problems you get into is when you have real complex curves and everything, you occasionally have areas where you have to go in and rebuild it anyways. And for instance, on the Enterprise, one of the most difficult parts of the Enterprise was just doing the neck. But it's not that difficult when you actually go into it. What I did for the Enterprise, for instance, was first I just made the disc, which was just a big disc, and it had a couple segments, and I stretched in the top. And I knew that I had to connect from this point to this point down here, which was on the main section down here. So I just had the two sections separate, and then I could go into wireframe and literally, connect the dots across there. Because just trying to figure this out, how to do this out of boxes or something, it became easier to, work with the general shapes and then connect them manually, right, and figure out how is it across there.
Do you want to take, yeah. Go back. You just did it magically. Just go back and show what you did there real quickly.
And this is where I have the tendency to use the wireframe preview a lot. So I could go in and I know that this is going to be connected to this. It's going to be connected to this and then to this. And then I'll just hit P for polygon, and I'll just start adding polygons basically.
And now, you can see how in that 3D mode where you're moving around, you have the perspective mode, it's a lot easier to pick one specific point as opposed to the orthographic views. You have to go pick one, then deselect points, stuff like that. So it's a much easier way to go in and use this perspective view. In fact, yeah, just keep going with that, Kenny, while I'm yapping. Okay. But in fact, one of the ways this was first used was the first paying job Ken had, probably 4 years ago or something like that, we had to model a heart, an actual human heart, for a medical CD-ROM or something like that. And this is like in 2.0 or something. And with an object like that, there's no way to, you know, if you're just trying to use the perspective views, you'll go insane. Especially, we had to put arteries and veins in the heart and stuff like that properly. So that's where Kenny really started getting into using that perspective view and doing, you know, almost all his work in terms of selecting things up there. And again, this isn't, you know, what you're seeing here is he's actually going through selecting points and making polygons by hand. Not the sexiest thing in the world, but it doesn't take that long. And then once he's created that, it's going to metaform. It's going to metaform very, very nicely. Okay, back to your gun, Ken. Okay, so this is sort of the rough shape. And what Kenny was referring to before is the fact that when you go in and do metaform, you can't have polygons that have, it's more than quads now, I guess. Is that right, Kenny?
Well, with Metaform Plus, you can do more than 4, but generally you want to keep them the 3 and 4-sided polygons.
Right. So in other words, he wasn't creating these polygons as 3 or 4-sided polygons, but now he can go back through and just break them up very, very easily. You know, again, there's functions like the triple function, which would turn it all into all three-sided polygons. That would be bad. Triple's a bad thing to use at this point because it ends up creating a lot of extra things in a way that you can't really control. But anyway, he's just going back in and creating these as simple 4-sided polygons.
Yeah, one of the reasons I like to, again, work with the overall big shapes is because you try and work as simple as possible. And by, you know, seeing, you know, how it's broken down in the first place, and by making it in the bigger shapes. And I can show you a better example of this, which is the boat thing. A lot of people think you have to build everything into the model, and that the model has to be really, really complex to be a beautiful model. I completely disagree with that. All it has to do is look good. Again, this isn't CAD. I'm not creating buildings here. I'm creating really cool looking visual effects. As long as it looks good, that's all that really matters.